Hello, and welcome to video 2 in this three-part video lecture series on post-stroke fatigue, where we go through reframing post-stroke fatigue, looking at a new neural inefficiency lens. In the first video, we kind of looked at the base level of post-stroke fatigue, went over what the current science is for the neurophysiology and neuroscience in post-stroke fatigue, and connecting it to those common presentations that we see. In this video, we'll be taking a deeper look into those sensory impairments and those sensory processing impairments, exploring the neural mechanics of sensory reweighting, sensory attenuation, and seeing how that all impacts occupational performance. The learning objectives for this presentation are to describe the proposed neural mechanisms contributing to post-stroke fatigue, explain how disruptions in predictive sensory motor processing contribute to increased perceived effort and neural inefficiency, discuss the relationship between sensory processing impairments and occupational performance within PSF, and recognize how a mechanistic understanding of post-stroke fatigue provides the foundation for targeted clinical evaluation and intervention. The plan for this video is to do a brief recap of some of the neurophysiology and the neuroscience from lecture 1, so it's nice and fresh, go into a deeper dive into the sensory processing impairments found in post-stroke fatigue, talk about the predictive processing of task performance as well as in predictive processing within post-stroke fatigue, and then finally wrap up discussing occupational performance in post-stroke fatigue. To begin our recap of the first lecture, we'll start with the anatomy and physiology of post-stroke fatigue. Our key areas of impairment where we'll really be hyper-focusing into are the prefrontal circuitry, the occipital-temporal framework, and frontal striatothalamic circuitry. And what's important to point out, again, this is not specific to damage in this region. It is a widespread processing issue, which processing happens throughout these areas, with that prefrontal circuitry being the one in charge of our problem solving and our task completion. The occipital temporal network really giving us our understanding of what's important and what's not, helping this salience network determine what needs to be in the prefrontal in the executive and what can be automated down into the default. The frontal striatothalamic circuitry, that whole web of sensory motor processing, and the basal ganglia becomes that physical filter of where that information is going and coming into and out of. And it is some impaired functional connectivity in these areas that is what PSF is really being illustrated to be. Those impairments are the resting state imbalance between the anterior and the posterior, with hyperactivity in the prefrontal circuitry and reduced hypoactivity in the dorsal, in the posterior parts of the brain, happening at rest. And again, that reduced functional connectivity within the default mode network, the prefrontal cortex, and the frontal striatothalamic circuitry. And then the sensory motor impairment of this measured as impaired or altered cortical spinal excitability, with those motor program calculations being done right up until that very last second before the motor signal is shot out and the plan is sent out. The processes that are impaired by these connectivity issues being sensory reweighting, the dynamic prioritization of external sensory input based on the reliability and the relevance to the task, and sensory attenuation, the brain's ability to downweight predictable and self-generated sensory input, really clearing the path for any exteroceptive information coming in to be analyzed. And then the combination of these two processes, sensory processes, predictive processing, which is how our brain goes about planning out how we do every task of our day. And this is the imbalance of the intero and the exteroceptive signals that are at the heart of the impairment in predictive processing and the root of some of the post-stroke fatigue symptoms. And there is an increased reliance on bottom-up processing, meaning there is an increased reliance on the exteroceptive, putting more work or more strain onto process of sensory reweighting when it's already impaired due to the stroke. Continuing in, we'll review the triple network model and its relationship to post-stroke fatigue, the key relationship being that its anatomical regions are directly associated, if not directly the ones that are shown to be impaired in post-stroke fatigue. I am saying this kind of with ambiguity because there has not been, outside of REN 2024, there hasn't been much studies that directly associate post-stroke fatigue symptoms or post-stroke fatigue itself with the default mode network, or with the triple network model. And it seems to be more and more trending in that way. And this is where we're kind of pushing the the boundaries of current understanding. This is fresh, this is new, which is the point of this project, to bring the current research to you, the practitioner, to reduce the research to practice gap. And this triple network model perspective of post-stroke fatigue is one of those ways in which I'm doing it. So with that little caveat out of the way, that refresher again, we have the central executive network, the salience network, and the default mode network. The central executive being that executive in charge of goal-directed action, task completion, and problem solving. The default mode network being in charge of setting the internal state, internal processing, and maintains that baseline automated activity. And that salience network detecting what is relevant between the intero and exteroceptive signals to the current task and getting things done, and mediates the switching between the two. What is important needs direct processing by the central executive network, or what is something that we either expected to happen or is just not relevant to the task right now, so it just stays in that default mode network. So it doesn't take up any extra processing speed, thought process, or any extra computational sources for task completion. To end off our recap, we just have our key factors of post-stroke fatigue. We have neural inefficiency, that at-rest baseline altered resting state activity and imbalance between the frontal and the posterior portions of the brain, as long as the increased local level of processing demand, which depends on both the areas of the network that are whatever task specific to that area of processing, as well as any damage that has been done due to the stroke or any other conditions or any other incidences or injuries that the patient may have. This imbalance in the local level processing demand compound to impact that higher level network impairment, that triple network model. So impairing connectivity between these regions and reducing the efficiency in coordinating attention and effort, reducing the efficiency of coordinating task completion and occupational performance. So as a result, there's increased executive control, reduced automaticity of task, and a higher cost to initiate, sustain, and regulate performance. And on the right side, we just have that cycle of breakdown with impaired sensory reweighting and reduced sensory attenuation compounding upon each other, having the collective impact on predictive processing mismatch. That imbalance between interoceptive and exteroceptive leads to increased corrections, increased computational cost, and slower execution of task. And what this culminates in is a loss of automaticity. That is, that tasks now require conscious control. Basic routine tasks before the stroke now require conscious effort, continuous processing that takes metabolic, physiological demand just to get it done, and then that translates down into impaired occupational performance, the need for increased rest breaks, or the need to completely terminate the task. So before we get too far into this section and discussing the sensory processing impairments in post-stroke fatigue, I just want to highlight the fact that I would really be kind of talking somewhat in generalizations. I'll get into some of the specifics of the processes themselves, but I'm talking about generalizing to all of occupational performance and task completion as a whole, looking at really focusing on the neural inefficiency of it. When we get into it, sensory processing and sensory attenuation both have greater impacts further into things that I won't be discussing today, things like cognition, emotional regulation, mental health, and other aspects. And so while that research is out there and is very interesting, and it definitely relates to and has an effect on task performance and occupational performance, as well as just general well-being for patients, for stroke survivors, and just for occupational performance in people as a whole. We will really be focusing on the neural inefficiency of it and how that compounds to reduce participation and the capacity to perform the task. That research for everything else is out there is very interesting, but I just want to set it first that we'll be focusing in this kind of very specific area, and these two processes, as well as predictive processing, go into much more depth in other areas of occupation, health, and just being. We'll begin with sensory reweighting, which again is the dynamic prioritization of sensory input, specifically exteroceptive input mostly. That's the balance between visual, vestibular, and somatosensory sensation. These key functions, some of the key functions are dynamic gain control, adjust neural weights based on the signal reliability, and sensory conflict resolution, switching between the three based on which one is more reliable. This is, again, I mentioned in the first lecture, leaving the movie theater and having the sun, those bright lights, bleaching your retinas after being in the dark for so long. Your vision is no longer reliable. While it's a very intense signal, that bright light coming into your eyes so abruptly, your brain, your CNS switches to the somatosensory and the vestibular to maintain balance, maintain upright posture, and continue the task of leaving without falling. So post-stroke, there's permanent damage to the central gain control mechanism. That bright, high-intensity light coming in has a much bigger impact on the processing of that task of remaining upright and walking than it did before. Specifically, there's a fixed, rigid over-reliance on a single suboptimal sensory channel. Typically, post-stroke, we see this in vision. The patients are more highly reliant upon vision. So that same image of coming out of the movie theater and that bright, intense light is going to have a bigger impact on overall performance of that task of leaving and walking, because the signal is already intense coming in, and the brain's capacity to weight it effectively is down. And so you'll see a much greater response, and perhaps even a fall or a need to stop moving so that it can maintain balance so that they don't fall. This also leads to a reduced error correction and reduced adaptation to environmental changes. That's that need to stop moving, stop walking, find a place to sit, or in worst case scenarios, that's the fall. Unable to correct that error, unable to adapt to the ground beneath them, or the fact that they're falling so quickly, unable to send that motor signal to get that leg to stomp as quickly as it needs to get that fall to not happen, all stems from an impaired ability to effectively re-weight, which isn't just, again, balancing out, saying this one's the best, this one's the worst. It also has to determine which one is most relevant, which one is most reliable. So in that same example, with the light being so bright, that signal is definitely intense. The cells on your eyes are definitely responding with a very high, strong signal. But just because that signal is intense doesn't mean it's important, or doesn't mean that it's the one we need to be reliant on the most. And with impaired sensory reweighting, it's difficult to let the brain know that to stop focusing on vision and to focus on something else. Or its capacity to upweight somatosensory, proprioceptive, and vestibular signals is also impaired, so it can't switch the way it needed to. So now we'll get into the first little bit of evidence-based research. In this lecture, we have Awosika et al. And Dewan et al. 2023, who each looked at sensory reweighting. Awosika looked at sensory reweighting capacities in chronic stroke survivors, and Dewan looked at sensory reweighting in 36 healthy young adults. And we'll take a look at that one first. So their methods were some forms of perturbation training, essentially. Visual, somatosensory, vestibular, and combined sensory perturbations just during standing balance. And they measured postural sway, joint motion with EMG activity. What they found was that sensory reweighting occurred across all conditions, so it's kind of a base thing, that process that we all use. That there's greater upper body control with visual perturbation. So as vision becomes more impaired, the body tenses up upper body, bringing kind of, if you think of it from a biomechanical perspective, bringing that center of gravity more in, maintaining a rigid, trying to find stability. In somatosensory and combined perturbation, so when both vision, vestibular, and proprioceptive impact or perturbations occurred, there was greater lower body control, grounding themselves, being more rigid, not sure where to go, over-analyzing, trying to maintain some level of postural balance during these perturbations. And that they found that motor strategies change based on sensory reliability. So with the process of sensory reweighting has a direct impact and a direct connection with physical performance. So in this case, maintaining posture, or just maintaining upright balance and moving the joints. And it showed that it's all dependent on the perturbation, depends on which body part or which body region is really going to be affected and which way this is going to impact performance. So when it's dynamic, it has a widespread sensory motor impact on performance as it goes through, and is very fine-tuned. So when we look at Awosika, who looked at 58 ambulatory chronic stroke survivors, they used the modified clinical test of sensory interaction and balance to assess sensory reweighting and sway. They used a 10-minute walking test, both fast and slow-speed walking. They had a number not completed, but what they noticed was that there was a reduced walking speed, decreased acceleration, and increased asymmetry and that an increase in sway was weakly correlated with gait. So as they walked and as they moved, they had an increased sway, increased level of instability, so base. Task failure strongly linked to severe impairment, so the worse the sensory reweighting capacities were, the more likely they were to reduce participation and not be able to complete the task. And that reweighting capacity, not magnitude, drives function. So that again is the light. So we're going back to that example of leaving the movies, the sun, the bright light bleaches the retina. That's a large magnitude of signal coming in. And so it doesn't determine what's important based on the strength of the signal. It determines what's important based on the relevance of the task. And then if the systems and the pathways responsible for sensory reweighting have the capacity to adapt, that's what determines function. If these processes are impaired and lack the capacity to effectively adapt, function is reduced. And that is what we see in post-stroke fatigue patients. So for those with post-stroke fatigue who are living with a reduced capacity for sensory reweighting, this really impairs the capacity for just basic daily function and routine tasks. There's a greater reliance on conscious motor control, so there's a greater conscious effort for motor processing, motor planning, and motor execution, which includes the adaptations during the movement that we typically don't require conscious control, leading to an increased cognitive load during movement or task completion, leading to a higher perceived effort and earlier fatigue. And again, there is a higher perception of effort because there is more conscious awareness of every little task that's going on. And then there's actual increased effort at the metabolic level due to the increased computational cost of existing because of the increased cognitive load due to the increased need for conscious central executive control over task performance. And so there's an early performance breakdown, even seen during routine tasks, where they need more breaks, or they can't do the task at all, which typically leads to the elimination of the task and not doing it anymore. And this isn't something that is going to improve without direct treatment into this process. For a brief case example I have here, supermarket gridlock. And this is something that's great so much about how these underlying mechanisms impact post-stroke fatigue is that they're very easy for us who haven't had a stroke to relate to. This kind of impairment, while it's chronic in those with strokes and who've had a stroke due to the damage to the brain, these are like passing moments that we all experience when you're extremely tired after a day of long work. If you had a full caseload of max assist patients, and then you had to go to the grocery shopping afterwards, or if you had a really rough workout, you didn't sleep very well. These fluctuations in connectivity and the balance and the signaling of the brain, this is something this supermarket gridlock came from one of my own experiences. But it translates because it's the same neural systems and the same neural mechanisms that are being overloaded that lead to task abandonment or the need for a break. So you're going after that long day, whatever it is, you're going into the grocery store. It's bright, it's loud, there's new advertisements everywhere. There's bright colors, loud music, people hustling, bustling. If your grocery stores are anything like mine, there's a little sound of the rain that comes on before the water for the produce. And there's stuff going, there's beeping, there's lights, there's everything. There's too much. And so the brain fails to downregulate the chaotic environment, and there's just increased noise in the brain, increased filtering going on. And we don't really talk about it. I won't really get into it here today, but the attention. You have to then sometimes ooh, look at that, ooh, look at that. You have to pull yourself back in and focus on what you need to get done. And the more tired you are, the less capacity you have to wrangle yourself. And you might catch yourself wandering on something for 5 to 10 minutes. And there's that for the post-stroke fatigue, there's that sensory teller loss. The system's unable, say in this case, system's unable to perceive stable ground inputs. Say for a second you're turning, your vision is no longer reliable. You're turning, you're looking at something and you're turning. So as you shift, you'll switch to, as your vision becomes less reliable, somatosensory, proprioceptive inputs, vestibular inputs. But say your proprioception, this is a hemiplegic leg, and there's still some impaired sensory loss there. can't really feel the foot, turn, almost fall, but catch yourself. That quick metabolic action takes so much effort. And the occupational deficit that comes with the vision is spatial disorientation and that quick fall. Everything leads to a task abandonment. Gotta take a break. Have to shut down. Maybe it's just for a few seconds. Maybe you're stuck there for a while. That's kind of what post-stroke fatigue patients don't know. What leads to some of the task abandonment and the reduced participation is because like I can get there, but I can't guarantee that I'm going to leave or I'm going to make it out of there. So eventually task participation reduces, social participation reduces, because at the sensory level, the sensory processing level, it's just too much to do just to be there. Now we'll move on to sensory attenuation. Sensory attenuation, again, is the suppression or downweighting of self-generated and predicted sensory input. Sensory attenuation is the reason why it's difficult or you can't tickle yourself because you expect it coming, right? Key functions is predictive suppression, the suppression of predictable self-generated sensory feedback or signals. This includes Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles, joint compression signals, all of those things coming in as we go to complete a task. For example, we'll say grabbing your water bottle or grabbing a glass of water. When you reach for it, that motor plan has the predicted sensation of the extension of the elbow, the flexing of the elbow to come back, the contraction of every muscle, where it's supposed to go, how it's supposed to feel, how long it should feel that way, just a crazy amount of information. And so that when you grab that water bottle and you touch it and you actually complete the task and you start all the external exteroceptive information that comes with that task, that suppression is there so that we can effectively analyze what's going on. And so that when you grab it and it's slightly heavier or slightly lighter, you can adjust accordingly, correct whatever error that is, and complete the task without it needing to be a conscious effort. It also has its role in gaze and postural stability, maintaining steady vision and balance during movement. It has set the path that we are supposed to go. So any deviation from that gaze or posture for the completion of that task should be and will be, thanks to sensory attenuation, considered an error and adapted to as necessary. And this is that balance between sensory attenuation and sensory reweighting. Sensory attenuation sets the path so that we can use our sensory reweighting capacities to determine what adaptations need to be done due to exteroceptive information and the dynamic changing environment that we're constantly in. And the way that path is set is through corollary discharge or an efference copy. This enables rapid comparison between predicted and actual sensory feedback. This is the signal that goes out before the motor plan that tells us essentially what all that's supposed to feel like, what we're expecting to happen. And it is based off of the difference between this predicted action, the suppressed action that kind of sets our internal state, gives our internal image, leads to the sensory map of what is expected to happen that we correct ourselves off of. And if it is a small error, it just happens, no issue. We don't need to. You grab that water bottle, it's a little bit heavier. Yes, your shoulder may activate a little bit, your elbow tightens, your grip tightens a little bit more, but you didn't tell that to happen. It happened due to sensory feedback coming in and subcortical extrapyramidal systems. This is a very precise and intricate system that again has impacts outside of physical motor completion of a task. It's cognition, self-perception, in mental health. It's implicated in psychosocial conditions like schizophrenia, OCD, things of that nature. But in this case, post-stroke, there's an inability to quiet the background noise from your own movement. And at times, what happens is the system perceives internal movements as unexpected external stimulus. So instead of the rate of muscle elongation or the rate of joint elongation, that muscle spindle signal, which is typically suppressed because we know what's about to happen, it's not something we need to worry about. That is now perceived as an external signal that leads to a larger error message because we weren't expecting to feel it. And so now it creates this kind of this loop back into itself of what we thought was going to happen wasn't suppressed the way it should have been. So now those sensations are being taken in as external sensation, which further taxes sensory weighting pathways because they're already impaired. And now it has extra information to weight, and it's not really sure what to do with it. And so you can sometimes get caught up in the loop of trying to figure it out. So you see slower movement initiation, dysmetria, things of that nature, or complete task breakdown, and they just stop, or they freeze. The next piece of evidence-based research we'll cover in this lecture, I'll briefly discuss the study by Kilkenny et al. In 2023, where they looked at sensory attenuation processes in 28 healthy adults. And what they did was they measured self-generated touch during a task with one perturbation at an expected 53 milliseconds, and then one unexpected sensation at 153 milliseconds. These were done by having low pressure tips on the left and right finger. The left finger the dominant finger was pressed at 53 milliseconds expected during a task, and then there was an unexpected one 100 milliseconds after at 153 milliseconds. And the participants were rated their perceived touch intensity. Did they feel it? How strongly they felt it? Things of that nature. And they did this in an MRI for a functional MRI measurement of the somatosensory, cerebellar, and motor network and activity in these areas. The key findings they had was a delayed feedback response, during a reduced sensory attenuation, The touch felt stronger. So the delayed touch felt stronger in compared to the expected one. And they saw increased activity between the primary somatosensory cortex and the supplementary motor area and the cerebellum. And they saw reduced connectivity between the somatosensory cortex and the cerebellum and the motor planning regions. This connectivity can be explained by these connections, one from the somatosensory cortex and the cerebellum, and the other the supplementary motor area and the cerebellum. One leads to the attenuation of a response because it's not important. It's either expected or not important to the task, right? This delayed response, this 153 millisecond response, had an increased response. It was brought in higher to update the internal model. It was taken as an error signal when it should have been attenuated. And this is a potential mechanistic link for that increase into the cognitive, for that increased perceived effort, where the cerebellum is unable to, they were unable to attenuate this sensation, and so then the cerebellum sees that as an error that needs to go up to the higher level of processing. This needs to be adapted to, we need to adjust based off of this. And we'll get into this later, but from a treatment's perspective, when that comes to learning, if these errors happen at too fast of a response, typically we can't learn from them. The cerebellum can't update the internal model, but it will still try. But it doesn't have enough time for that process, because typically that process of learning in the cerebellum needs at least, I think it's 400 milliseconds, don't quote me on that, that's a lot. From the last time I saw it was around 400 milliseconds for the cerebellum to effectively learn from an error and incorporate it into the internal model so that it's in there. And this was seen in healthy adults. So this impairment, as I said earlier, is something that just happens. Things can happen at a speed too fast for us to actively, efficiently, or effectively recover from. But in those with post-stroke fatigue, that is happening more and more and more with every task they intend, whether it's just sitting there and breathing and watching TV or trying to work. So what this means for post-stroke fatigue, or what it could mean for post-stroke fatigue, is that prediction errors increase perceived effort. Reduced sensory attenuation may amplify fatigue perception as it continues to try to update. And it continues as the brain keeps filing these self-generated, what should be attenuated signals as external signals that need correcting. It's continually trying to update the internal model, which leads, or at least contributes to that impaired cortical spinal excitability, because it's still trying to adapt. This is the method or the mechanism by which the brain is still trying to adapt to motor signals and feedback as the motor signal is going out. It can't prepare the sensory attenuated efference copy because it's constantly adapting to what it is as it is generating that efference copy. It is unable to effectively suppress the expected, and therefore that is constantly being looped into the programming and the processing of the motor plan. So this impairment in network efficiency is increasing processing demand because these loops are just continuing to happen and there is no learning taking place. It is not updating the internal model, though it continually tries to. And this increased processing demand leads to greater error and earlier task termination. This is the potential mechanism for why perceived effort exists, why things feel more difficult and heavier and just take more energy for those with post-stroke fatigue. Because this is a loop that is consistently happening as the cerebellum struggles to update what is a perceived error because the efference copy and sensory attenuation cannot effectively suppress internally generated signals, whether that's expected for the task or just trying to maintain resting. To provide a case example for sensory attenuation, we have here titled the loud appendage. So this would be the example I have, that image of folding the laundry. A lot of arm movement, a lot of flexing the shoulder, the elbow, extending the elbow, the wrist, the hand, the fingers. There's a lot of things going on, tactile stimulation, different textures, different fabrics, different sizes of things that you have to adapt to. And so when this happens, you have for post-stroke fatigue and with sensory attenuation impairment, there's unmuted movement. So the cortex is processing self-generated movement as an external threat, like we said. As you go to fold the laundry, every time you lift the things going on, you flick the towel out and you try to fold it in halves into a smaller square. That's how I was taught to fold towels growing up. Each time you make that movement, you are activating the Golgi tendon organs, you are activating the muscle spindles, you are activating joint receptors and touch receptors, deep touch, light touch, all these things going on, and they are just signals compounding and compounding on the nervous system. And more, we are unable to attenuate them, and they rise to the central executive. They are perceived as external stimulation, external sensation that was not planned, that is a threat, and needs to be adapted to. And so then you have conscious tracking of motion. Every time you feel the fingers switch, your eyes are on to make sure your grip is there. Your eyes are making sure that it's folding in the right way, maintaining those lines that you want. So the simple motor task of folding a towel or folding a napkin is starting to require high effort and cognitive monitoring because the arms themselves are continuously signaling the brain. And this signal is not being suppressed at all, or it's just not being suppressed enough to where it's quiet. So it leads to increased computational costs. It leads to increased signaling noise as the cortex, specifically the primary motor cortex, tries to make sense of what's going on and continue the task at hand. And so there's extreme friction during basic chores, which triggers rapid increase in fatigue. Because from a motor planning standpoint, a cognitive standpoint, it is becoming too much. And then if you stack on what were the physical impairments from a post-stroke, is there spasticity? Is there hypotonicity? The condition of the appendage itself hasn't even really become a problem yet in this task, outside of the poor and rigid priors that come from it, but we'll discuss that in the next section. The actual physical capacity of completing the task isn't even a problem in this situation yet for post-stroke fatigue. This could be simply imagining what's going on. Guided imagery, thinking about doing the laundry can trigger the same effect. And for those with post-stroke fatigue, this is a continuous cycle. It might seem like a pathway, but it is definitely a cycle. It is continually happening over and over and over again at any given time. And this is where that cost of perceived effort comes in. This is where the behavioral cost of the increased computational load of planning a movement and experiencing daily life through sensation, which is the way we experience life is just simply draining their capacities for actually living and performing whatever they need to do in their day. We'll move into discussing predictive processing and task performance, and in general to predictive processing in post-stroke fatigue, and how the combination of sensory weighting impairments and reduced sensory attenuation culminate to impact this process, predictive processing, for task performance and occupational performance. So we've already discussed the role of sensory attenuation in task performance a bit. We talked about the efference copy and how it sends this signal out that sets the expected path, that suppresses the expected sensory consequences of the task that we are about to complete. So if we stick with the water bottle example, from how it should feel as your shoulder flexes, your elbow extends to where you have that co-activation of the tricep and the elbow when you pick it up, activation of the shoulder, to the temperature of the water bottle, the texture of the water bottle, the feeling of the straw in your mouth, the feeling of the water, the temperature of the water, all of that is preset by sensory attenuation. And all of that is compared to the actual sensory consequences with sensory weighting to tell us what actually happened compared to what we thought was going to happen. So in steps predicts, forward model generates the expected sensory consequence. We compare that to the actual sensory feedback of the task that happened, filter the expected from the unexpected, reduce calorical processing because all of this has already been preset, so it's simple and doesn't need to get up that high, doesn't need to bother the central executive, and it is updated with extrapyramidal, non-cortical, semi-reflexive responses. Nice and simple, you drink your water, you go back to work. For example, if you were documenting, you reach, you take a sip, you put it back. Or you reach, it's empty, you get up and go get water. It is based on the difference from the expected, from the predicted to the actual consequences determines the behavior afterwards and our ability to adapt to it. So with sensory attenuation and the efference copy paving the way for what we expect and predict to happen, since it is the task of sensory weighting to bring in the exteroceptive information, compare that so it can be compared to the predicted and adaptations can be made. So adjust sensory importance based on reliability and noise, changes dynamically depending on the environment, calculates the optimal middle ground between prediction and feedback, and filters the error, decides whether a sensory mismatch requires updating the brain or ignoring it. So that error filtering, that is required. Both that process is something that sensory weighting and sensory attenuation come together to determine. If the internal model, if the predicted is so far off, that error signal is going to be huge and require a huge one. So if you're going to, huge correction, sorry. So if you go to grab your water bottle and mid-transit it falls out of your hand, that needs to update the brain model. You need to then send a whole new message to catch it. A whole new set of coordinates, degrees of freedom, a whole new motor plan has to be determined. Because it was big error, big difference from what's going on. Or was it slightly heavier than you thought and you just had to activate the elbow a little bit more to make up for the change in weight? So if that small error of adapting to a slightly heavier water bottle than you expect, that's extrapyramidal. That's the rostral spinal cerebellar tract coming up to let you know, okay, off, fix it, come back. As it slips from your hands and your eyes look over and realize that it's completely falling and you have to make that new plan, that requires updating the internal model. And with post-stroke fatigue, what we see is an inability to kind of determine what the difference is. And so either they don't catch it, hits the floor, they try to catch it and miss, try to catch it, say they're standing and fall. So defined simply, predictive processing is the brain anticipating reality and pre-programming your actions. Its key function is predictive error correction. It aligns expected sensory feedback, our afferent copy, with actual reality, the consequences of action, exteroception. And that fine balance determines how well we're able to maintain what we're doing and task performance, whether that's task participation in general or high performance in a task. Simply writing your name, high-level calligraphy. These two processes help gauge in between those two spectrums of performance. In post-stroke, there's misweighted external inputs that collide with unattenuated signals, loud and poor internal suppression, poor priors, inability to effectively weight external signals and compare those in importance with the internal generated signals. So if we're using the movie theater example again, if the brain is already poorly aware of, say, where the foot is, or if they have lower extremity spasticity and they have a rigid ankle that doesn't plantar flex the way it should, or vice versa, have foot drop and they don't dorsiflex the way they should. That combined with the bright light limits the ability to adapt effectively. And so the computational difference between the expected and the actual explodes. It falls apart and the brain can't fully adapt to it under the stresses of the current situation. And so what we see is a real-time perception action loop halt due to a sensory confusion. And sometimes it's a full complete stopping of the task, whether that's a freezing and like kind of, hey, what's going on? Or the physical capacity makes them completely stop and they need to take a break, sit, or worst case scenario, they fall. But what we also see in the less severe physical cases in the higher level stroke survivors is it's an increased error when typing. It's an inability to hold on to something for as long as they used to, or stand up in the posture that they used to have. And you see them missing a key more, missing a cup more, forgetting things. And again, we're not going to get too high into the cognitive aspects of sensory attenuation and sensory processing and sensory reweighting. That's kind of outside of the scope of this specifically, while technically still in the scope of occupational performance. But you see them caught in this loop that requires more time, more computational cost, more physiological cost. All of this is taken and it leads to a need for rest or complete termination of the task. For the last piece of evidence-based research in this study, I'm going to return to one of the studies from lecture 1. This is the study by Dodonker et al. In 2020, looking at the reaction speeds, and where we saw the corticospinal excitability impairments. Reaction speed, the slow reaction speed, the ability to get themselves ready in this task, was the capacity for themselves to take hold of their faculties and just move their finger, taking in all the sensory information that's going along. And what we see here is that those with slower reaction times, those with higher fatigue, who have difficulty initiating actions or just with this kind of reaction speed, what it shows us is that real-time, being stuck in that real-time loop, unable to initiate a task at an effective speed enough to get it done, or what that means. This is extrapolating a lot with this study because they did just do finger abduction. But if they require extra time to organize and plan simply moving your finger away from midline, consider a higher complex task. Consider moving all the fingers, say when typing, eating, dressing. The more complex the task, the more difficult it's going to be to organize the program. So this study for me really shows where that impaired programming is, where that live action loop freeze, where they get stuck in doing it. It can happen at the beginning of the task, like it did here, or as the task continues. Because life, occupation, the things we do, those are sustained actions. Sustained actions require feedback, and they require efficient processing, balancing, weighting, filtering of feedback to sustain a task. And this is where post-stroke fatigue is really presenting its impact for those with post-stroke. Life is a sustained task. And any sustained task is 2 to 3 times. That is just a random number. There's no evidence to support that level of multiplication, but they are living life harder. The basic parts of life they are living more difficultly. It takes more effort, more computational costs, not to just get out of bed, but to get comfortable in bed. And we won't even talk about sleep disturbances and how much that packs. This is a widespread issue, and I'm losing the reins here. This lecture focuses more specifically on task performance, but you can see how this extrapolates into every aspect of life, because the basic aspects of living for these patients is much more difficult. I wanted to provide a mechanistic model of predictive processing and sustained task action. So here I have two images of a closed loop system. And on the left, you'll see a healthy closed loop system. From the initiation of the task or goal, the motor command is feed forward. The predicted sensory consequences are clear. The comparison between the predicted and the actual is fine. There's a small error, if any at all, and task completes simply. Task performance is fine, whatever level that is. For those with post-stroke fatigue, they have a sort of altered system. The task or goal is imagined as the way it is, planned the way it is. But from the very beginning, the motor command, the feed forward aspect of it, the expected predicted input is impaired. There is impaired prediction due to the sensory attenuation. So the efference copy is unable to effectively clear the path for what needs to be done and set those sensory consequences in, so we have something to compare to. So then when the task starts from the initiation, there's a larger error signal, which leads to increased error processing, which eventually, because you can imagine if you're typing and you're continually having to backspace, you'll see, I need to focus on the keyboard a little bit more. So there's more error, which draws more conscious attention, and those internal signals are being misperceived as external signals, external stimulus. So then that is overloading or increasing the tax on the sensory reweighting systems that then lead to a greater level of error correction, and this cycle just continues. Just in here, and we'll get into this in a little bit more depth in the next section. We'll look into this where I'm circling right now kind of directly. But is in this cycle where post-stroke fatigue, you see it in action. So as we look into it more, we get into this cycle of breakdown, and you'll see what we have here. Is that impaired prediction? I have that in green. That's the resting state impairment. That's the hypofunctioning posterior part of the brain, hypofunctioning default mode network, and the hyperactive or the overfunctioning central executive prefrontal cortex. It's already working more from base. So what we see anywhere after that, when the task is initiated, what you're seeing is a faulty system in action. And so you have the baseline impairment and sensory attenuation and reweighting. You have impaired prediction, leading to more error signals and a greater level of correction. Reduced sensory filtering, which is increasing the input load, increasing the sensory reweighting and taxing the sensory reweighting systems even more. You have increased feedback reliance. So as the sensory reweighting systems is being tasked, you are also we're also focusing more on the feedback. The central executive is analyzing every piece of feedback that comes in, whether that's truly exteroceptive information or if that's misinterpreted internal signals that have risen to the executive. So there's just increased feedback coming in and an increased computational cost of processing it. So you have high effort demand, reduced automaticity because things can't be relegated to the default mode network anymore. The brain is not able to effectively suppress those internal signals, the Golgi tendon organs, the muscle spindles, the joint receptors. It's not able to put all those things down. And so everything is being pushed into the executive. And so there's increased perceived effort, as I keep using the muscle examples and the joints, those receptors. You have an increased perception of those. So you feel like your arm is more fatigued. Because typically, you don't feel muscle fatigue or muscle soreness until after, or when you're going to really go in for like a max rep of something. but now they're feeling it continually because it's in the executive. It's no longer automated. It doesn't rise to the executive when it becomes an issue. It's consistently considered an issue. And so that is where in this cycle of breakdowns in post-stroke fatigue happens. And that recursive cycle of error processing and increased external sensory feedback coming in this is that mechanism of increased perceived effort. It happens in these two cycles here. What I have in red, that recursive error processing, the larger error signals requiring more conscious awareness. The cerebellum is continuously trying to push things to update the internal model, but it's not getting there. So in this breakdown, we have that reduced sensory attenuation leading to impaired prediction feedback, increasing sensory prediction errors, increasing precision weighting of sensory input, because sensory weighting is still going to do the best it can to dynamically weight what's important and what's not. And then you have that impaired connectivity that was shown to us in that study by Kilkenny of increased cerebellar and somatosensory processing, increased error correction. This pathway, I am sure, is the mechanism, but is beyond the scope of my capacities and beyond the scope of this lecture to really say that with any confidence. This is the pathway of increased neural processing demand. It is widespread, but in this error correction loop in task performance, specifically in a closed loop system, the system required for sustained action, there is too much information coming in, and the brain does not have the capacity to efficiently and effectively process it. And so this leads to increased perceived effort, as well as increased effort. It's kind of both. We're focusing on perceived effort because that's trackable, but it's also a behavioral response to this increased metabolic cost. It's this increased perception of effort, which then continues to compound to lead into reduced task participation until eventually there's complete cessation of task. To sum up the sensory processing and impairments in post-stroke fatigue and the impact it has, is that it increases the computational toll. At its core, post-stroke fatigue has impaired functional connectivity between neurons. At the neural level, there is a metabolic and physical impairment that impacts the neurological filters and the pathways at the cellular level. At the processing level, the sensory weighting is impaired, so they have a preference for a specific rigid sensory channel, which is typically vision. In people with neurological conditions, vision becomes heavily used, and proprioceptive and vestibular senses are not reliable or are actually hypofunctioning. From the attenuation perspective, the cortex can no longer quiet its own internal movement noise, so every aspect of what was once hushed, from the proprioception to muscle spindles and everything coming in that tells you where we're going, is now being incorrectly processed as external stimuli, leading to increased prediction crash. Massive prediction errors that stall real-time perception of the action loop. They are caught actively processing sensory information up until the moment that the task needs to start. We see that from the reaction speeds, but it's also seen physiologically in the impaired corticospinal excitability. And from an occupational perspective, everyday life has switched from mostly being automated to things that don't require your effort to everything requiring your effort. High effort manual cognitive tracking of every day. That's from getting out of bed to getting comfortable in bed at the end of the day. And what we see is that our current approaches do not address this. It does not address this leak of energy at the cellular level, this imbalance of processes, and how that compounds to impact occupational performance. And understanding these is the key to mechanism-guided intervention and evaluation, not in that order, obviously. But now that we know what we can target, and we know that these targets directly influence post-stroke fatigue, we can start doing something about it and actively and actually returning energy to these people so that they can live their lives at the level of performance that they want to. We'll wrap up this lecture by finally linking these impairments to occupational performance and trying to give a good solid understanding of how these baseline sensory processing impairments, sensory reweighting, sensory attenuation, and they compound upon the task performance and predictive processing, and kind of expanding that into full occupational performance and how that impacts these patients. Just briefly again bringing up the triple network model, just the central executive network, focusing on that task-focused processing, attention, working memory, and control. The default mode network, our internal processing, our baseline internal signals, the automatic state, internal model, that automatic activity, all regulated here, and the salience network, the one that's switching between the two, dynamically detecting relevant internal and external signals and mediating that switch. So what's really illustrates the combination here, well, as the default mode network is no longer able to sufficiently suppress internal signals, and those rise to more into the salience network to match the signal and the importance of the external, they both get pushed up to the central executive. And the altered connectivity between regions really impairs the ability to fluctuate the fluctuation and the passing of signals and information in this system. And this is a widespread system. Haven't gone over the specific anatomy of it, but actually we did in the first one. If you'd like to go back to that first lecture to refamiliarize yourself with the anatomical locations associated with each region, as they do also kind of overlap with each other. But it is the balance and fluctuation of signals within this model, within these regions of the brain, that allow for occupational performance at any level. This model will find some level of performance and make it work. It is our job to promote the efficiency of this model so that task performance, basic participation at any level can then progress to full occupational performance. And that's determined by the level and capacity of each patient. To illustrate the triple network model's influence on our ability to take hold of our faculties and maintain occupational performance at whatever level is needed for life, I have this image again stolen from my first lecture, where we have the triple network model on the left, outlined with the corresponding colors on our cognitive hierarchy on the right. And as the default mode network, represented by that blue dotted line, becomes weaker, the salience network, by that solid red, indicated by that solid, thicker red line, has to work harder because it's filtering more and more and more information. And the central executive, in the green, bold green, has taken over more, the control of more, the conscious control of more of what is going on. In a way which you can think of is the default mode network, essentially a sensory attenuation, setting everything to where it needs to be. The salience network being that sensory reweighting capacity, being able to filter those sensations and figure out what's going on, so what's important for problem solving. And the central executive is the combination of the both. That is predictive processing. That is the ability to take control of what we have, what our faculties are, and put them towards task performance and task completion. It is our ability to muster everything that we have and perform, given why this translates so easily into occupational performance. Occupational performance is one's ability to take control of their faculties, biological, psychological, social, every capacity they have, and perform, which is sometimes that's just living life, sometimes that's getting your job done, and for those athletes and anybody else who exists in a high level of performance, their occupational performance demands are going to be more. And so the triple network model provides a neurobiological basis for occupational performance, in my opinion, but also one's ability to effectively navigate these networks is what determines occupational performance and one's capacity for it. And it's our job, through evaluation and treatment, which we'll get into in the next lecture, to improve these processes, because it will improve their ability to take control of their faculties, of their skills, of their abilities, and put them to performing, whatever that means to them. Really set this idea, this concept of sensory processing and predictive processing aspects to the purpose of finding occupational performance and tracking them to occupational performance deficits, I'm going to use the PEOP model. It's widely used in stroke care, and it's one of my favorites. So we have on the left that process of increased effort perception and just impaired sensory processing, increasing neural demand, increasing perceived effort, reducing task efficiency and endurance, reducing occupational performance. From the aspect of the person, impaired sensory processing, increased prediction errors, increased perceived effort. When this matches with a sensory-rich environment, dividing higher cognitive demands, greater effort is required. From an occupational standpoint, it's reduced task efficiency, slower performance, decreased endurance for the task. As performance go, activities need to be modified or completely avoided. There's a reduction in participation and a decrease in occupational performance, meaning a decrease in their capacity to complete these tasks the way that they used to, and return to what their independence was. And more importantly, since not everyone returns to full independence, but they can return to full occupational performance. And that is partially determined by what that means for them now post-stroke and what conditions they're set in, but also it's determined based on what they want to do. Because while it's definitely not our job to cap them at what their performance is, it is our job to keep their expectations realistic. And normally, as a student, I've had limited participation from a clinical side with stroke survivors. In my clinical rotations, I got a good amount. Before I went back to school as an exercise professional and exercise physiologist, in the last 2 years before I went back to school, I was working almost exclusively with neurological conditions, clients with neurological conditions. And I've seen their capacity for high level performance, and I know what they're capable of. And a lot of them still want to perform at a high level, whatever that means for them. For some of them, that's just puzzling. Sitting down and completing a puzzle, high cognitive task. Other that's playing the piano. And for those who are working with me, that was weightlifting, running, and getting back to being active again. But I do know that they have a drive to perform. And at current, our approaches to this are not returning them to the level of performance that they want. Granted, that might not be impossible. That might not be possible given what level they want and what level they're left at after the stroke as a physical capacity. But people love to perform, and they love to be good at things. And performance doesn't always mean being able to do everything you used to do, but it means being able to confront and adapt new things and find new areas of growth without feeling like you can't or that it's going to take too much out of you. And that's really what I feel our job is here and what our current approaches are doing. And using this method, applying our understanding of these neural mechanisms that underlie these impairments in performance is the best way to get these people back to their performance, whatever that is to them, and for us to be providing the level of care that they deserve. So just drive this home one more time with the performance cost of neural inefficiency, that neural inefficiency at the root of post-stroke fatigue. Neural resources are depleted more rapidly. Again, as I mentioned in the first lecture, this is a resource allocation issue. This is not a strength issue. This is not fully an endurance issue or the way we physically address it. And it's not completely an issue of a motivation or anything psychosocial that comes through. It's a resource allocation issue. That impaired connectivity at the cellular level is having impacts on sensory reweighting and sensory attenuation processes, and they just build and build and build and build. The increased neural effort drives increased perceived effort. There is a metabolic and computational cost to this increased brain activity. And we see that in increased perceived effort partially, and then we see that in the early crash. Because that increased perceived effort drives that early fatigue and functional limitation, whether that's attentional, being able to maintain attention on the task, the physical capacities to start the task, or the physical capacities to maintain the task. It begins as a resource allocation issue and it trickles into everything else. And that's one of the main things I wanted to point out today when it comes to post-stroke fatigue. It is more so a resource allocation issue than anything else. And we need to be training their brains to be better at allocating those resources, to be better at putting things where they need to be and understanding what's important and what's not, rebalancing prediction and feedback. the internal model and the consequences of action. So some closing thoughts that I'll leave you with at the end of this video. That again, post-stroke fatigue is not simply fatigue. It reflects inefficient neural signaling and impaired sensory motor processing. These processes of just being have become too expensive. Understanding why post-stroke fatigue is occurring helps us understand how to better target it. And instead of throwing everything at energy conservation and pacing, prioritization, and planning, getting to the root cause of the issue and addressing it. And we do this through mechanism-driven assessment, which enables mechanism-driven intervention. Understanding these mechanisms, sensory reweighting, sensory attenuation, predictive processing, better helps us decide our evaluations and our treatments to target these things at their core, which we'll go over in our next lecture, where we'll build a clinical framework that links evaluation and treatment to these neural mechanisms so that we can start really addressing this thing. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in the next lecture.